The world lost someone very special today. Hulk Hogan, known by millions as one of the most famous WWE superstars ever, has passed away. People from all over the globe loved and admired him for many years. His death has shocked fans everywhere. Now, at the age of 79, Vince McMahon, the longtime WWE chairman, has spoken about Hogan's passing. In public, Vince called Hulk Hogan the greatest wrestler of all time. But according to some insiders, what he said in private was much more troubling. His private comments have surprised many in the wrestling world and made fans start to question what their relationship was really like. This situation has started a new conversation about who Hulk Hogan really was, what kind of legacy he left behind, and how Vince's words may change how people remember him. On the morning of July 24, 2025, a sad moment took place in Clearwater, Florida. Around 9:51 a.m., a 911 call came from the home of Hulk Hogan. Emergency responders arrived quickly and found him unresponsive. Paramedics worked for over 30 minutes, trying CPR and other life-saving methods, but nothing helped. He was later taken to Morton Plant Hospital, where doctors declared him dead at 11:17 a.m. He was 71 years old. The news of his death didn't feel real to many people. Hulk Hogan had always seemed like a superhero, strong, unstoppable, and larger than life. But behind his powerful image, he had been quietly dealing with serious health problems for many years. Years of wrestling had put extreme pressure on his body. The moves that made him famous, the leg drops, body slams, and dramatic returns to the ring, had come at a heavy cost. He had gone through many surgeries, especially in recent years, and the pain never completely went away. In May 2025, Hogan had a major surgery on his neck. It was a serious operation, but he stayed positive. His wife, Sky Daly, told people he was healing and doing his best to stay upbeat. But those who were close to him said that things were more difficult than they seemed. Hogan had a hard time walking without help and was almost always in pain. Even though he tried to keep a strong image, his final years were filled with struggle. Now, with Vince McMahon's latest comments, people are looking at Hogan's life, career, and final days in a whole new way. The surgery Hulk Hogan had hoped would help him feel stronger didn't work the way he wanted. Instead of giving him new energy, it left him feeling weak and tired. People close to him said he had changed in ways he could never fully recover from. Pain was nothing new to Hogan. All through the 2000s and 2010s, he had gone through many surgeries, on his back, his knees, and other parts of his body, because of the years he spent pushing himself too hard in the wrestling ring. In interviews, he was honest about the metal rods that had been placed in his back and how even basic movements had become difficult. But even then, he always tried to sound strong. He would smile, talk with confidence, and say that his fans gave him the strength to keep going. Still, even the strongest fighters have limits. In the last months of his life, Hogan stayed out of the spotlight. He made fewer public appearances and chose to focus on his health, his faith, and his family. His wife, Sky, was a constant support. She stayed by his side through everything, helping him manage pain, going to the hospital with him, and being there through long, uncertain nights. The man who had once performed in packed stadiums now spent his days quietly, reflecting on life. He sometimes gave small updates to let people know he was doing okay, but mostly, he stayed away from cameras and media. There were no scandals in his final days, no dramatic interviews or shocking news. Just quiet. That quietness made his death feel even more sudden. For someone who had been such a loud and powerful part of the wrestling world, and even pop culture, it was hard to believe how silently he had stepped away from it all. But the moment he died, that silence disappeared. News outlets, wrestling companies, and social media all lit up with tributes. Fans posted their favorite memories, shared old videos, and talked about how much he had meant to them. WWE held special tribute segments. A traditional 10-bell salute was performed at wrestling events to honor him. His impact was clear. Hulk Hogan had left a mark on the world that wouldn't be forgotten. Still, behind all the videos and kind words was a sad reality. Hogan's body had simply reached its breaking point. All those years of putting everything into his wrestling career had finally taken too much from him. In the end, he didn't pass away in front of a crowd or under bright lights. He died in a simple home, surrounded by people who truly cared for him, far away from the roar of the arenas he once ruled. This was truly the final chapter, the end of an era that many thought would never come. The wrestling world suddenly found itself facing something it had never really imagined: life without Hulk Hogan. As tributes came in from all over the globe and fans mourned the loss of a childhood hero, quiet conversations behind the scenes began to surface. Not everyone remembered Hulk Hogan the same way. Even those who had worked closely with him, including Vince McMahon, seemed to carry more complicated feelings about the man behind the legend. Before the fame, before the bright lights, packed arenas, and championship belts, Hulk Hogan was just Terry Gene Bollea, a boy from Augusta, Georgia, who wanted to be in a rock band. Wrestling wasn't part of his original dream. It came into his life almost by accident, starting with a favor for a friend in the wrestling business down in Florida. That one small step led to something no one could have predicted: a career that would completely change sports entertainment and influence pop culture forever. By the early 1980s, Hogan had become much more than a wrestler. With his muscular build, his signature handlebar mustache, and his bandana, he looked like no one else in the ring. But what really set him apart wasn't just his appearance or wrestling moves. It was the way he connected with people. When he told fans to train, say your prayers, and take your vitamins, it wasn't just a catchy line. It became a belief system for an entire generation of kids who saw him as more than a performer. To them, he was a real-life superhero. Then came WrestleMania, the event that changed everything. In 1985, Hogan teamed up with Mr. T for the main event of the very first WrestleMania. That match wasn't just watched by wrestling fans, it was seen by people everywhere. Suddenly, Hogan was more than a sports figure. He was on cereal boxes, in Saturday morning cartoons, in toy stores, and on late-night talk shows. He had become a part of everyday life. For Vince McMahon, Hogan wasn't just a star. He was the face of WWE. When his entrance music Real American played, arenas exploded with cheers. Whether you were a child or an adult, Hogan represented the battle between good and evil, and good always won. But that kind of fame came with a heavy cost. The pressure to stay at the top was intense. The spotlight never went away. His body was pushed to its limits year after year, and behind the scenes, the toll it took was beginning to show. By the time the 1990s rolled around, things were starting to change. The wrestling industry was evolving, and so was Hogan. In 1994, fans were shocked when he left WWE and signed with WCW, a rival company. Many people couldn't believe it. How could the man who symbolized WWE now be working for the competition? But instead of fading away, Hogan surprised everyone again. He changed his character completely. Gone were the red and yellow outfits. He turned into a villain and became the leader of a new wrestling group called the New World Order, NWO. Now dressed in black and white, he called himself Hollywood Hogan. It was a bold move. Fans were stunned, some even angry, but it worked. He had managed to reinvent himself in a way that very few others ever could. People loved to hate him, and he was just as popular as ever. Years later, in 2002, when he returned to WWE, the reaction was massive. Crowds filled with old and new fans welcomed him back with open arms. The cheers were deafening, showing that no matter what role he played, hero or villain, Hulk Hogan had become something permanent in the hearts of fans. His story was one of transformation, survival, and influence. But beneath the colorful costumes and larger-than-life persona was a man who had lived through decades of pain, pressure, and reinvention, until the final bell rang. When Hulk Hogan returned to WWE in 2002, the response was overwhelming. Fans didn't just cheer, they roared. Even after all the years that had passed, the energy of Hulkamania was still alive. Hogan had done what few ever could. He had gone from hero to villain and finally become a legend, all within one lifetime. But his legacy wasn't perfect. In 2015, Private recordings of Hogan making racist remarks were made public. The backlash was immediate. WWE cut ties with him, and his reputation took a serious hit. It was a painful reminder that behind the larger-than-life character was a real person, one capable of saying and doing things that hurt others. Hogan later issued public apologies, and after some time, WWE quietly brought him back. Still, for many fans, that part of his past was hard to forget. Even with controversy, Hogan's influence couldn't be denied. He wasn't just a wrestler, he was one of the first true bridges between professional wrestling and mainstream entertainment. He appeared in movies, walked red carpets, had his own reality TV show, and even tried his hand at music. Wherever there was attention to be had, Hogan knew how to grab it. But what really made him a legend wasn't just being in the spotlight, it was how long he stayed in it. For over 40 years, Hulk Hogan remained a recognizable figure. Children who once wore his shirts and imitated his poses grew up and introduced their own kids to the legend of Hulkamania. It wasn't just a moment in time. It became a tradition, passed down like a favorite story. That's why his death felt so shocking to so many. Whether someone loved him, criticized him, or simply remembered watching him on TV, almost everyone felt the same way. Hulk Hogan seemed like someone who would always be there. He felt immortal, unbreakable, eternal. Now that he's gone, fans are left with an unsettling question. If someone like Hulk Hogan can pass away, who's left to believe in? He had been more than just a star. He had been a symbol. And in the middle of this grief, one voice was noticeably absent. Vince McMahon. The relationship between Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon was legendary in itself. It was full of highs and lows, built on fame, business, power, and eventually, personal distance. You can't tell the story of Hulk Hogan without also talking about Vince McMahon. From the start, their paths were tied together. Vince gave Hogan his big break, believing in him when others didn't. Hogan, in turn, helped Vince build a global wrestling empire. Together, they didn't just create stars, they built an entire era of sports entertainment. Back in the early 1980s, Vince saw something in Terry Bollea, something no one else quite noticed. Hogan didn't have the technical skills of some wrestlers, and he wasn't the most polished on the mic. But what he did have was something rare: presence. When Hogan walked into a room, people paid attention. Vince knew right away that this was the guy who could take wrestling out of small local shows and turn it into a television sensation. And he was absolutely right. Hulk Hogan became the driving force behind WWE's rise from a regional wrestling promotion to a national phenomenon. Without him, there likely would have been no WrestleMania, no Saturday morning cartoon series, and no Hulk Hogan action figures lining store shelves across America. Vince McMahon saw Hogan as the perfect face for the company, and Hogan stepped into that spotlight like it was his destiny. Together, they introduced the world to a new kind of storytelling, one where larger-than-life heroes and villains battled it out every week, and the fans couldn't get enough. But with great success often comes great tension. By the early 1990s, rumors started circulating behind the scenes. Hogan was accused of using his influence to shape storylines in his favor, keep himself at the top, and hold back younger talent trying to rise. Vince, known for being fiercely protective of his power, began noticing the signs. Their once perfect partnership was showing cracks. Then came the 1994 steroid scandal, which shook the entire wrestling industry. Hogan was called to testify in Vince McMahon's high-profile court case. Hogan admitted he had used steroids, but claimed that Vince had never forced or encouraged him to do so. Still, just having to testify created a visible strain. The trust between the two men was damaged, maybe not completely broken, but certainly changed. That bond they once shared now had a quiet distance between it. When Hogan left WWE to join WCW, it felt like betrayal to many, especially Vince. He never openly expressed it, but the frustration was obvious. Hogan, the man who helped build Vince's empire, had now taken his fame to the competition, and succeeded. The creation of the New World Order (NWO) in WCW made Hogan relevant again, this time as a villain, and fans embraced the transformation. Meanwhile, Vince saw WWE's ratings begin to slip for the first time in years. The so-called Monday Night Wars made every move personal. On the surface, the shots were subtle, but behind closed doors, those in the business said Vince was both angry and intrigued. He couldn't deny that what Hogan pulled off in WCW was impressive. But he never forgot that Hogan had walked away when the company needed him most. When WCW eventually collapsed and WWE became the top wrestling brand again, the path was open for Hogan's return. But it wasn't the same. Their reunion in the early 2000s felt more like business than friendship. Hogan received a thunderous welcome from fans, but behind the scenes, things had changed. Vince had built a new generation of stars, The Rock, Stone Cold, and others, and the company no longer depended on just one man. Still, there was a level of respect between the two. Vince inducted Hogan into the WWE Hall of Fame and gave him the stage to relive his past glory in front of massive crowds. Hogan remained a special attraction, a symbol of the past, even if the emotional connection that once tied them together was gone. Their relationship had become professional, not personal. Then in 2015, when the scandal involving Hogan's racist remarks became public, Vince McMahon quickly distanced WWE from him again. Hogan's name was removed from promotional materials, his image was cut from videos, and the company went silent on him. It was clear that whatever fragile piece they had rebuilt was once again fractured. Hogan's controversies reminded everyone that even legends are flawed, and Vince made the decision to protect the company's brand above all else. Though Hulk Hogan would eventually return to WWE after his public controversies, those close to the situation say Vince McMahon wasn't eager to bring him back. He understood the risks. He knew the backlash would be loud, and the damage to the company's image was real. But nostalgia is powerful, and in Vince's world, business always came first. That was the nature of their relationship, built on power, fame, money, and a fair share of pain. They had lifted each other up, watched each other stumble, and yet, they never fully turned their backs. Because at their core, Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan weren't just partners. They were the two faces of the wrestling empire they built. A world that couldn't have existed without both of them. When the news broke that Hulk Hogan had died, fans all over the world held their breath, waiting to hear from Vince. At 79, Vince had been through everything. Scandals, legal battles, losses, but this was different. Hogan's name wasn't just part of WWE history. It was part of Vince's own story. And when he finally released a public statement, the wrestling world paid close attention. His words were brief but respectful. The world lost a treasure today. Hulk Hogan was the greatest WWE superstar of all time. He gave everything he had to the audience whom he appreciated, respected, and loved. He ended with the line Hogan had made iconic: train, take your vitamins, and say your prayers. Today we pray for him. It was the kind of tribute people expected. Polished, heartfelt, final. But behind the scenes, something different was happening. According to several insiders, Vince McMahon's private reaction was not the same as the public one. In the days after Hogan's death, during a quiet meeting at WWE headquarters, Vince reportedly opened up to a few longtime colleagues. He wasn't on camera. There was no script, no PR team, just honest words among people who had known both men for decades. Those present said Vince lowered his voice, shook his head slowly, and said something that left the room silent. Hulk Hogan was not the man you think he was. It wasn't meant as an attack, they say. It wasn't cold or bitter. It was honest. Vince, after years of holding things in, was finally speaking from the heart. Their relationship had always been complicated, a mix of loyalty, rivalry, business wins, and deep regrets. And now that Hogan was gone, Vince apparently felt there was no need to keep pretending. One person who had worked with both men for many years described the moment. Vince wasn't angry. He was reflective. He told them that people fell in love with the character. Hogan in the red and yellow, dropping legs, hulking up, and defeating evil. But the man behind all of that, Terry Bollea, was far more complex. Not the perfect hero people believed in. That comment quickly spread among WWE circles. Some dismissed it as a moment of sadness, frustration, or even unresolved grief. Others believed it was Vince finally letting go of decades of image management. With nothing left to prove and no more legacy to protect, he was finally telling the truth as he saw it. Vince McMahon didn't speak those words in a press release or on television. He said them in a quiet room, among people who had seen both the spotlight and the shadows. And in doing so, he may have changed the way the world remembers Hulk Hogan, not by destroying the legacy, but by reminding us that every legend, no matter how big, is still human. One insider added something even more revealing, that Vince McMahon hadn't just spoken honestly after Hogan's death, he had also expressed regret. But it wasn't regret for what he said privately. It was regret for what he never said while Hogan was still alive. Behind all the success, the championships, and the spotlight, there had always been a quiet resentment. Hogan had walked away during some of WWE's darkest moments, most notably during the steroid scandal, and only returned when it suited him. And when he did return, he brought baggage, controversy, scandal, fallout. And every time, it was Vince who had to deal with the mess. In front of the cameras, they stood together. They smiled. They spoke well of each other. But behind the scenes, they stayed apart. It was a partnership on paper, polished and professional, but not one built on personal closeness. Still, Vince's official statement honoring Hogan stood. It was respectful, carefully crafted, and in many ways, exactly what the world expected from a man in Vince's position. But according to those who truly know Vince, that public tribute wasn't just for Hogan, it was for the brand. For WWE. For the fans. Because no matter how complicated things had become between them, Hogan was still a pillar of WWE history. And that's what makes this final chapter so hard for many to accept. Fans wanted a clean ending. A full circle moment. They wanted to believe that the man behind Hulkamania passed on with peace and mutual respect. But life rarely ends in perfect storylines. Behind every chant, every bright light, and every dramatic entrance, there are real people. Flawed, hurt, proud, and human. So when people say, at 79, Vince McMahon finally breaks silence about Hulk Hogan's tragic death, they're not just talking about a press release. They're talking about something deeper. The moment when the truth, or at least a piece of it, slipped out. Quiet. Raw. Unfiltered. In that moment, something shifted. Fans were left to wonder if Hogan and McMahon had ever truly understood each other. Not in the beginning, not at the end, and maybe not even in between. Once Vince's private comment allegedly leaked, Hulk Hogan was not the man you think he was. The wrestling world did what it always does when real life blurs with storyline. It split. Some were shocked. Others nodded, not surprised at all. But no one stayed neutral. Hogan's death had already triggered a wave of grief, nostalgia, and reflection. Now, this quiet, off-the-record remark sent tremors through the industry. The first person to speak publicly after Vince's official statement wasn't a wrestler or a promoter. It was Nick Hogan, Hulk's son. Just days after his father's death, he stood in the center of a SmackDown ring as the bell tolled 10 times in honor of his father. He didn't mention Vince. He didn't need to. His eyes were red, his face strained, but his posture was proud. That was his message. Later, in a backstage interview, Nick spoke directly to the fans. "My dad gave everything to this business," he said. "That's what matters. That's what I'm holding on to." It was simple, honest, and in its own way, a quiet defense of the man behind the mustache and the muscles. One by one, wrestlers began to share their thoughts. Veterans, new stars, people who had worked with Hogan, wrestled him, admired him, or clashed with him. Some focused on the legacy, others on the man. But the conversations that followed weren't just about mourning. They were about memory, truth, and the space between who someone is and who the world believes them to be. Hulk Hogan may be gone, but the echoes of his life, and the lives he touched, are far from finished. Ric Flair, a man who shared both rivalry and respect with Hulk Hogan over decades, posted a message that struck a delicate balance. Part tribute, part caution. Say what you want. But Terry was one of a kind. You don't have to love every piece of a man to respect the whole. Coming from someone who knew both the spotlight and the shadows of the wrestling world, the message spoke volumes. It was honest, raw, and real, just like their complicated friendship. John Cena, one of the few superstars who connected the golden age of Hulkamania with the modern era of WWE, chose a quieter tribute. He posted a backstage photo of himself shaking Hogan's hand, with a single caption, "Thank you." No commentary. No sides. Just appreciation. But even in its simplicity, it carried weight. Cena's silence on the controversy said as much as Flair's words. It was about choosing respect over judgment. Still, the divide was growing. Some wanted to protect Hogan's legacy, to remember the joy and inspiration he brought. Others felt it was time to pull back the curtain and look at the full picture, flaws and all. The conversation spilled into online forums and podcasts, where fans debated with passion and intensity. Was Vince McMahon being truthful or just bitter? Was it cruel to speak that way after someone's death? Or necessary, as some argued, to finally correct the myth that Hogan had carefully built and protected for decades? Plenty of people in the business weren't shocked at all. One retired wrestler told a podcast anonymously, "Everyone knew Terry wasn't perfect. He played politics. He had favorites. But so did everyone else. That's just the business. Vince played the game better than anyone." It was a reminder that the world of wrestling was never just about storylines in the ring. It was also about what happened in locker rooms, boardrooms, and behind closed doors. Meanwhile, WWE itself remained completely silent. There was no follow-up to Vince's public statement, no response to the alleged private comments, and no clarification from corporate. Insiders said the message from the top was clear: don't engage.